Something is coming back from Ukraine. Not missiles, not NATO, not another counteroffensive, but men. Hundreds of thousands of them. Russia sent them to fight a war that was supposed to be quick, glorious, decisive, but instead they were fed into trenches, drones, mud, and a grinding front that chewed through bodies faster than the state could admit. Many signed contracts that legally bind them to service until mobilization ends. Some were mobilized by decree. Others were recruited from prisons with promises of freedom. They left believing in victory, but they're coming home with trauma, resentment, and a memory of betrayal. History shows that regimes don't usually fall because enemies break in. They fall when the men trained to defend them stop believing in the system. And that's what's coming from Ukraine. Not an army, but a generation of soldiers who may no longer fear the state and no longer trust it. This is how wars come home. And this time, they're coming for Russia itself. To understand what's heading back into Russian society, we need to start with a single document, Presidential Decree number 647, signed on September 21st of 2022. It didn't just announce partial mobilization. It did something far more binding. It converted every mobilized citizen into a contract serviceman, legally locked into military service until the state decides that the mobilization period is over. The enumerated exits are narrow, reaching the age limit, being declared medically unfit by a military commission, or a court sentence of imprisonment. That's it. No opt-out, no appeal, no timeline. Hundreds of thousands of men strapped into a war machine with no clear expiration date. Remember, this was supposed to last 3 days. Russian soldiers reportedly packed dress uniforms in their rucksacks, expecting a victory parade in Kiev. That was almost 4 years ago. And the scale of what this war has consumed defies easy comprehension. The UK Ministry of Defense estimated that in November of 2025, Russian casualties surpassed 1.1 million killed and wounded since the full-scale invasion. In 2025 alone, an estimated 415,000 Russian soldiers were killed or injured, the second deadliest year of conflict. Over the last 2 years combined, Russia has burned through nearly 900,000 troops, a force nearly 5 times the size of the original invasion army. At its worst, the front was consuming over 1,500 Russian casualties a day. The independent tracking project run by BBC Russian and Media Zona has verified by name more than 200,000 Russian military deaths, and their data reveals who is actually paying the price. About 67% of confirmed dead came from settlements with fewer than 100,000 people. This war is being fought and died by men from villages, small towns, and Russia's most forgotten corners. But here's the detail that keeps changing the entire equation. This isn't a conventional army coming home. It's something far more volatile. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service estimated that by early 2025, at least 180,000 of Russia's total fighting force were convicted felons, recruited straight from prison. Now, Russia's own Federal Penitentiary Service data backs this up. The country's prison population dropped by 120,000 between January of 2023 and January of 25. The recruitment started under the Wagner Group, offering pardons in exchange for 6 months of combat. The UN raised the alarm in March of 2023, describing coercive tactics, detainees denied access to lawyers, and recruits sent to Ukraine without identification documents. Many of these men have been serving time for violent crimes, and now they're returning to civilian life with veteran status, state awards, and the legal protections that come with being called a hero. So we're not talking about one unified force, we're talking about multiple overlapping streams. Mobilized citizens who never wanted to serve, career soldiers who have seen years of combat, volunteers drawn by money or ideology, and former convicts pardoned through bloodshed, each carrying different expectations, different grievances, and wildly different thresholds for violence. That diversity makes unified political opposition pretty unlikely, but it also multiplies the flashpoints, because each group believes the state owes them something different. And when those debts go unpaid, well, each group will respond in its own way. The numbers alone don't topple regimes. What happens inside those men? That's what changes everything. Modern combat doesn't produce heroes the way that state television suggests. It produces psychological devastation at an industrial scale. A landmark study in the New England Journal of Medicine found that soldiers returning from conflict zones showed substantially elevated rates of PTSD, depression, and other mental health disorders. And the majority of those who screened positive never sought treatment. The barriers were not just access, they were stigma, fear of being labeled weak, fear of losing careers and standing. But now place that inside Russia's system, where the problem is exponentially worse. Russia's own defense ministry estimates that 1 in 5 war veterans suffer from PTSD. The country has fewer than one therapist for every 7,000 adults, with even fewer trained in combat trauma. Post-Soviet military psychiatry has a well-documented history of treating psychological damage as a personal weakness rather than institutional failure. Academic research into Russian veteran rehabilitation has described a fragmented and chronically underfunded system where manpower management consistently overrides individual care. And in a culture where psychological vulnerability is socially punished, well, veterans don't seek help, because seeking help means admitting something that the state would rather pretend doesn't exist. But PTSD is only half the story, and it's not even the most politically dangerous half. What should truly alarm the Kremlin is something researchers call moral injury. Moral injury doesn't come from fear, it comes from betrayal. Psychologists have defined it as deep harm caused by events that violate a person's core moral beliefs, whether through perpetuating acts that cross personal lines, failing to prevent atrocities, or being betrayed by trusted authority. Here's the critical distinction. Fear-based trauma can settle into silence. People can manage fear, but betrayal doesn't dissolve. It hardens into permanent hostility. It rewires how a person relates to authority. Not just a specific leader, but the concept of obedience itself. And when that rupture spreads across hundreds of thousands of trained combat-hardened men, it stops being a medical problem and it becomes a political one. The conditions for mass moral injury on the Russian front are textbook. Soldiers were told that they'd be defenders of the nation, participants in something historic and honorable. But instead, they found expendability on a scale that's hard to fathom. Now, wave after wave of infantry sent across open ground into drone fire. Orders that prioritize capturing a single tree line over preserving 100 lives. Wounded men abandoned on the field because logistics to retrieve them didn't exist. Officers who stayed kilometers behind the line while conscripts walked into kill zones. And then there's the class divide. Many of these soldiers came from Russia's poorest regions, Dagestan, Buryata, Bashkortostan, while the sons of Moscow's elite never saw the front line. That disparity doesn't stay silent. It turns into a question that no amount of propaganda can answer. Who exactly is this war for? Now, when a soldier realizes that the state lied, that the glory was just marketing and the sacrifice was bookkeeping, something breaks that no medal and no bonus can repair. And that fracture doesn't stay on the battlefield. It travels home. It sits at kitchen tables. It festers in unemployment lines and overcrowded VA offices. It sharpens in the silence of a country that would rather move on than confront the men that it used up. When a nation cannot openly acknowledge the true cost of its war, it cannot repair the people who paid that cost. And when those people are trained in violence and steeped in betrayal, the silence doesn't protect the state. It incubates something far worse. Hey, if you're watching this and you want to understand the forces that actually bring empires to their knees, subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because what comes next, it's not theory. It's a pattern that history has repeated again and again. And Russia has already seen the first act. By December of 2025, a joint investigation by independent Russian outlet Vertska and Germany's Die Welt exposed the scale of the damage already unfolding. Returning veterans had killed or seriously injured more than 1,000 people inside of Russia since the invasion began. At least 551 were dead. 274 were murdered. 163 were killed through the infliction of severe bodily harm, and the rest from road accidents and drug-related incidents. Another 465 were left seriously injured, many permanently disabled. More than half of all victims were harmed by former prison recruits. The cases are harrowing. In one, a soldier on leave from the front line killed his wife on their wedding night in the Tyumen region. In another, a paroled convict turned veteran attacked his neighbors with a knife in Dagestan, stabbing a man in his own hallway before being wrestled to the ground by the victim's wife. He was later ruled legally insane, diagnosed with an organic personality disorder linked to his service. Now, these aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a pattern, and that pattern is escalating. And the courts are making it worse. In 90% of cases involving veterans, judges cited military service, combat awards, and military merits as grounds for lighter sentences. In nearly half the cases involving intoxicated defendants, judges simply didn't acknowledge the alcohol use. The message radiating through Russia's legal system is quite unmistakable. Serve in Ukraine, and the rules bend in your direction, even if you come home and kill someone. A separate investigation by Novaya Gazeta Europe found that at least 6% of demobilized soldiers have already been convicted of criminal offenses, and the trajectory is steep. Roughly 350 court cases in 2022, 2,500 in 2023, and over 4,700 in 2024. The wave is building. But this is still the early trickle. Some 700,000 men remain deployed. Across Russia's border regions, media reports describe surging violent crime and looting. Nationwide, serious crimes hit a 15-year high in the first half of 2025, more than 10% above the previous year and a staggering 32% higher than pre-war levels. The Kremlin knows that this is heading toward a crisis. Reuters reported in September of 2025 that senior officials, up to Putin himself, view the eventual mass return as a destabilization risk. Sources described explicit fears of a repeat of what happened after Afghanistan, when returning veterans fueled the organized crime explosion in the 1990s. One Kremlin source acknowledged that many vets won't match their wartime salaries once they're home, creating fertile ground for criminal recruitment. Another source insisted that Russia's political system is stronger today than in 1989, but confidence and capacity are not the same thing. Already, organized crime groups are hiring ex-soldiers as enforcers and contract killers, a phenomenon that analysts have labeled the Wagnerization of Russia's underworld. So-called khaki gangs, composed entirely of former soldiers, are emerging and clashing with established criminal networks, escalating both violence and the illegal arms trade. In one case tracked by Europol, former Russian combat veterans were hired by a crime syndicate to kidnap a drug trafficking boss across European borders. A chilling example of how these skills are already being exported. So, what's the state's answer? The centerpiece is a program called Time of Heroes, a management training initiative run through Russia's Presidential Academy, designed to fast-track selected veterans into government posts. Putin has framed this as building a new elite from those who served. The first cohort had 83 participants, just 83, from a war that cycled through hundreds of thousands of men. Nearly half the graduates received appointments, including regional governors and presidential administration roles. Over 1,600 veterans ran in elections in September of 2025, 800 winning seats. A Kremlin-linked think tank estimated that veterans could fill up to 40% of the State Duma after the 2026 elections. But the mathematics don't hold. A program can absorb hundreds, maybe a few thousand. The war has produced a veteran population that dwarfs every pipeline that Moscow can build. The Foreign Policy Research Institute found that Russia's reintegration model shoves execution costs into regional governments and employers, while the Kremlin keeps narrative control and takes credit for showcase appointments. Wealthier regions can offer something. Poorer regions, where most veterans actually come from, offer next to nothing. The Finnish Institute of International Affairs reached a blunt conclusion. Official efforts are insufficient for the unprecedented number of veterans that Russia faces, and visible inequality in benefits risks generating widespread social resentment. High rewards for a visible few, while the majority face bureaucratic indifference. That's not reintegration, that's a recipe for rage. Now, meanwhile, the police force meant to manage this transition is itself breaking down. Russia's Interior Ministry reported a shortage of more than 170,000 officers as of early 2025, because law enforcement can't compete with military bonuses. The Duma responded in October of 2025 by lowering hiring standards. The system is weakening the very institutions that were meant to contain the force that it created. And history has showed us what happens when that containment fails. In February of 1917, the Tsarist Empire didn't fall to a foreign army. It fell to its own soldiers. Years of catastrophic losses in World War I had broken trust between the troops and the leadership that sent them to die. When the Petrograd garrison was ordered to fire on civilian protesters, they refused. Troops turned their rifles around. The mutiny spread faster than any order could contain it. Within days, Nicholas II abdicated. 3 centuries of imperial rule ended, not because of military defeat abroad, but because the armed men at home decided that the regime could no longer deserve their obedience. After World War I, the new Weimar Republic faced a different version of the same crisis. With no reliable forces to maintain order, the authorities assembled the Freikorps, which are paramilitary units built from embittered, demobilized frontline veterans who had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. They were promised purpose, They were given weapons. In the short term, they restored a fragile order, but they also militarized domestic politics, normalized political assassinations, and created armed factions that answered to patrons instead of institutions. Veterans who had been forged by war became tools of factional power, and eventually, elements of this radicalized veteran class helped lay the groundwork for what came next in German history. The lesson is clear. Co-opting veterans, they can buy time, but it can also arm the very forces that tear a system apart. And there's the parallel that the Kremlin itself acknowledges: Afghanistan. The Soviet war produced a generation of Afghansti who came home to a society that refused to see them and a state that was unable to support them. Scholars documented how these veterans formed independent civil organizations. They weakened the Communist Party's grip on participation and public trust, and in the lawless 1990s, funneled combat skills directly into criminal and paramilitary economies. Disabled Afghan veterans, men with both combat training and really nothing to lose, became valuable assets for criminal bosses that were building empires in the wreckage of the Soviet state. They didn't overthrow anyone, they corroded everything. The state couldn't even acknowledge the war publicly for years, which meant that it couldn't acknowledge the men who fought it. Sound familiar? Well, today, Sergei Kirienko, Putin's first deputy chief of staff, the man running domestic politics, has openly called Ukraine's returning soldiers the new Afghansi. Now, he meant it as a management challenge. History suggests that it may become a prophecy. None of this means that a coup is coming tomorrow. That's not how it works. Veterans rarely storm palaces. What they do is more gradual. It's harder to stop, and in many ways, it's more devastating. They destabilize along three pathways. First, atomized violence, domestic abuse, addiction, street crime, community breakdown. This is already happening across Russia. The data is already ugly, and it gets worse with every wave of returning men. In the first half of 2025, Russia's FSB dismantled 157 arms trafficking networks through 51 regions and shut down 62 underground weapons workshops, seizing grenade launchers and over 140 kilograms of explosives. Illegal weapons are flooding into civilian life, carried by the same men trained to use them. Second, grievance politics. Petitions, demands for benefits that the system promised but can't deliver. Public frustration that sharpens into collective anger. This doesn't topple regimes on its own, but it confirms the betrayal narrative. Veterans are already discovering that the benefits that they were promised, meaning land grants, tax breaks, housing assistance, come tangled in bureaucratic delays, excessive paperwork, and regional budget shortfalls. When they see themselves showcased in propaganda while their actual needs rot in regional offices, resentment transforms into something with teeth. And third, elite competition. When a regime frames veterans as a new elite, their symbolic value rises. Regional leaders, security agencies, and party factions begin pulling veterans into patronage networks, not to serve them, but to use them. Time of Heroes is Moscow's attempt to control this process, but every pipeline creates expectations. And when the vast majority of veterans discover that they'll never pass through it, the promise of elite status becomes just one more lie. Critics have already noted that over 20% of Time of Heroes participants had extensive prior government experience, suggesting that the program just elevates connected insiders more than genuine frontline soldiers. We're not predicting revolution, we're describing corrosion, and corrosion is harder to fight than any invasion. Invasions are visible. They mobilize defenses, they unify populations, but corrosion is silent. It eats through institutions, trust, and loyalty until the structure can no longer hold its own weight. By the time anyone notices, the foundations are already gone. Russia's greatest threat isn't marching toward Moscow from the west. It's riding trains back from the front line, carrying wounds that the state inflicted and has no plan to heal. War ends on maps, but they continue in the bodies and the minds of the men who fought them. Russia sent hundreds of thousands to Ukraine, locked them in with legal decrees that have no expiration date, recruiting convicts with promises of pardons. It fed them into a front line that consumed over 1 million casualties, and it did all of this while telling them that they were heroes. And now Russia has to take them back. Men who know what expendability feels like. Men who've seen the gap between the Kremlin's words and the battlefield's reality. Men who have been trained in violence and hardened by betrayal. And history, Russia's own history, shows what happens when nations fall to absorb the men they broke. Those men don't disappear. They reshape the nation. So what do you think? Will Russia manage to contain what's coming home, or is the damage already past the point of no return? Well, let us know in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the forces that bring empires down, they never announce themselves. They just arrive.